you can have apes and primates, and you can have elephants and whales and so on. They're all different species, etc. And they're different because of their physical differences, right? So angels, it's a fascinating thing. Is it composed of matter and form? Well, it turns out to be an intellectual substance, etc. So some assert that the angels are composed of matter and form, which opinion endeavored to establish, so-and-so established, I can't say that, Avicebron, however you say it, in his book, The Font of Life. I tried to look that up, but I didn't spend enough time for it. For he supposes that whatever things are distinguished by the intellect are really distinct. Now, as regards incorporeal substance, the intellect apprehends that which distinguishes it from corporeal substance, etc. So my thinking is that today we don't talk about angels in science. In fact, when you ask GPT, ChatGPT, that question, think that's nonsense. Aquinas was thinking in one way, and science is totally different, right? Well, what I'm looking at is, where did these concepts come from? They were actually dealing with the same sorts of issues in the Middle Ages, but their concepts were based on a completely different narrative, right? And so they don't have concepts of forces, although angels have forces. So there's all kinds of interesting things associated with that. So my quiz question is, do you think that the thesis that the forces of the universe are our way of talking about angels today? Because what place do the angels have? Well, they're in between God, which is the creator, the source of everything, and us in the physical world. Well, what's in between us and the physical world today are the forces of the universe. So I'm just intellectually curious about that. But in intro courses, what you would normally get about Aquinas would be the 5 ways, because we've already covered the ontological argument with Anselm. And by the way, remember that Kant is the one who officially analyzed these different arguments for the existence of God and gave them their different titles. So the ontological argument, the argument from the definition of God, right? And remember, there's puzzles with that, and Kant does critique it. He brings it up and critiques it and argues as his main argument against the success of the ontological argument is that existence is treated as a predicate, a characteristic that you can then go and see, well, what's in the set of things that exist? Is it a predicate? And Kant argues that existence is not a predicate. But the following generation of philosophers say, well, of course it's a predicate. This magic marker exists, this one doesn't. Seems pretty clear. I mean, Kant is impressive, but he's not the end of all philosophical development, right? He's a stage on philosophy's way, if you say, right? And there's other aspects of this that I think are fascinating, and that is the association with language. When you think how language works, it seems like it's language that's forcing us to think that there is a largest pizza any place, right? It seems like it is language that forces us to think that if you define a concept as that than which nothing greater can be thought, and things exist, well, that than which nothing greater can be thought must be greater than the things that exist, so it must exist. That seems like a linguistic, grammatical thing. We can also talk about things that are the greenest thing. There are green things. Yes? What do knows there are some green things, even if you're colorblind, I guess, right? As a result, can I ask, is there a greenish thing? What's your intuition say?
There could be the Green Knight.
Maybe what kind of room changes between each person?
It might change between each person. There's lots of different colors of green. I was part of the green machine at one point. You know, remember I was in the Army. We were broken down when we were in basic training so that we were no longer ourselves, and then we were built back up as part of the green machine, you know, the green team, right? And then we discovered that the Air Force was blue. Well, that's a whole other thing, right?
Maybe the Navy.
The Navy too. Good point. Good point. No, I did work with Navy, but they always wore white. Whenever I worked with them, they wore white. In any case, the worst thing. There are bad things. Is there a worst possible thing? Has to be, right? Doesn't our language force it? The greenest thing, yes, it has to be. The softest thing, you could probably get into all kinds of problems. So it's not just an issue of the definition of God as that in which nothing greater can be thought. Although, remember, the negative approach to that definition means that you can't say, well, you know, there's a golden island, you know, and I can imagine this golden island, but guess what? There are no such golden islands as far as I know, right? Well, does that disprove the nature of this proof? Not at all, because you're talking about a very specific thing, like a unicorn, golden island. You were talking about the greatest island. Well, there is a greatest island. I think it's Greenland, officially, right? I think I asked that, right? You know, when you think, you know, what are islands, actually? Thank you, Aristotle. We have these categories that, you know, somehow language developed, and we're kind of stuck in them, right? Which is kind of interesting. So that's really the problem, is this proof that something exists that is that than which nothing greater can be thought. Is that a linguistic characteristic and not something that we can take out of language and think must be the case with regard to reality outside of language, right? See that problem? Good question. I don't know how to resolve that because I don't know how to get out of the prison house of language. I'm stuck in the prison house of language. Right? That's Frederick Jameson, no relation to me, calls it that. Actually, I think he's on my list, isn't he? If you're interested in Fred. Things pop up in my head because I used to read, I still read. I'm currently reading the new book on Elon Musk. And the other book I'm reading is Magnificent Rebels, which, terrific author, Andrea Wolf, with a U, W-U-L-F. And reason she's a terrific author is because I read her earlier book, The Invention of Nature, was about Alexander von Humboldt. Fantastic. These are all both parts of book groups that I'm in that meet every so often and we discuss the books together. So I didn't actually vote on Elon Musk. I thought when that book came out, I was like, no, I'm not going to read it. Evil. And then the whole group all voted for it. So we got to read it. Where am I? Okay, so there. Prison house of language. That's another issue for the ontological argument. But let's go to the next group of arguments defined by Kant, and those are the cosmological arguments. And 4 examples of that are in Aquinas's position. And that is based on looking at the cosmos and seeing what must be the case. And so he, of course, talks about the existence of God. Does God exist? Is it self-evident? Self-evident. Is it intuitive? Right? An obvious thing that that's the case. Well, notice in that he does talk about the ontological argument and points out that that's the nature of the ontological argument, that it's basically arguing it's self-evident based on the definition, although it's self-evident to some people and not to others. Notice he's very, very careful not to call those other people stupid. He doesn't, right? He does it in a very nice way, right? So it's self-evident. I think it's in here that he says some are ignorant, etc. But is it demonstrable? Can you demonstrate it? And so if he's kind of not really engaging with the ontological argument, but he does think it's demonstrable. How? How does he think it's demonstrable? Remember, he's an Aristotelian, so he likes Aristotle's arguments, and Aristotle has an argument for the prime mover. For Aristotle, the prime mover is the first mover, which, in my understanding, is the outer ring of the universe, and that the outer ring is moving. It's the prime mover. By moving, it causes the inner circles to move, and then they move, and then they move, and then you get to the air movement, and that causes waves and things and motion on the earth. Very convoluted. It doesn't really work, right? But nonetheless, you get this argument that there has to be a first mover. And there's an interesting puzzle here, because in order for X to move Y, and then Y moves Z, or whatever, right? You think, oh, okay, so what's your first question? What moved X, right? And you feel like, well, there must have been something that moved X. And then what was that? Z prime, whatever you want to, phi, whatever you want to call it, right? And that was moved in turn by something else, etc., etc. But Aristotle says you cannot take this chain of reasoning back ad infinitum, infinitely, right? Because if you did, time would actually be going in that direction instead of in this direction. But time is going in this direction, and therefore there must have been a prime mover or a first mover, an unmoved mover, right, that started the chain. Right? Convincing argument? If you like Aristotle, I suppose, right? In any case, obviously Aquinas likes Aristotle, and so when we look at his arguments, the demonstration can be made in 2 ways. This is the first way of looking at it, right? And that is to say that the cause, one is through the cause, and as a result is called a priori. A priori is just Latin for meaning before. What's before? And the opposite is a posteriori, which means after, right? So that's all that really means. Although a priori and a posteriori as a phrase became very symbolic of a particular way of looking at things. And we'll see that when we get to David Hume and Kant. We'll see that again. But at this point, the a posteriori route is looking at the world, and this is, so he has actually 5 different arguments. The first 4 are a priori arguments, looking at cause and effect, looking at the cosmos. So they're called the cosmological arguments. And then the 5th way is the teleological way, looking at the design argument. You've heard of this design argument, intelligent design, right? You know, that's the whole idea that, well, you know, an eye is so perfect, you know, in function, etc. We can't imagine a 1/3 eye. You know, how would it have evolved to have gotten to that point? Well, actually, what's kind of curious, if you read about biological creatures, you can see actually an evolved sequence that leads to